This is a CBC podcast.
You'll need to show proof of vaccinations to do a lot of non-essential activities in our province come next month. Already the vaccine mandate's raising questions about privacy and freedoms. Wayne McKay's here to look at the legal issues behind that. Wayne's a professor emeritus at Dalhousie's Schulich School of Law and our legal columnist on Information Morning. Morning, Wayne.
Good morning.
One of the arguments we hear from people who are vaccine hesitant is that forcing them to get vaccinated is a violation of their freedom of choice. Does that hold up as a legal argument?
Basically, I think the answer is no, in that it's usually put forward in the way that they're suggesting they don't have a choice whether or not to get vaccinated. And that's not actually the case. What it is that there are consequences if you do not get vaccinated. And the effect after October 4th and the proof of vaccine arrangements come into play is that you will not be able to get to certain events like restaurants or larger events or gyms and those kind of things. So they are putting limits on their choices, but by their own decision. So they're not being forced, for example, to get an injection, and they're not being forced to take one side or the other. They're making a choice, and there's different consequences for the choice they make.
And I suppose because it's not a workplace policy, it's not like your income will be affected because this applies to non-essential services, Wayne?
That's a really important point as well, that it is non-essential services. If it were essential services, that raises much more difficult questions, and it would be much harder to justify that kind of restriction. But we are talking about not minor things, but going to restaurants, going to gyms, going to sporting events, that kind of thing. So that is very important.
What about the argument that it's an invasion of privacy to ask for proof of vaccination because that's personal information?
Well, it is personal information, and particularly personal health information. And so the sort of starting position under various legislation, the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act and the PIPEDA at the government level, but rather at the business level. But that's just the first point. Then there are exceptions. And that's why, at the end of the day, I do not think it is an invasion, but it's one that can be justified, I think, based on the legitimate concerns about health and the protection of the health of most of your citizens, or all of your citizens, really. So, yes, it's initially a limitation, but it's not, at the end of the day, a violation. There's other kinds of exceptions, for example, administration of justice, or if, for example, in some cases, if they were trying to reveal information about child abuse, those kind of things. But health protection is a classic exemption for those kinds of rules.
Some scenarios just to run by you, Wayne. If I'm asking a repair technician to show proof that they're double vaccinated before they cross the threshold into my home, is that allowed?
I think it is allowed. First of all, in terms of who can enter your home, there's not a lot of restrictions legally anyway. But again, going back to the sort of nature of privacy, again, that's a private thing. But the person that you ask is not required to ask. There, again, will be consequences if they don't answer, presumably that you wouldn't let them in, or you ask for a different repairman, or you go for a different company or whatever. But again, you're not actually requiring them to answer. And there again, it's very important that you have a legitimate reason to be asking for that personal information. And in this case, you do. They're entering your home. There's some issues of COVID that may arise, and it's your right, in my opinion, to ask that person. It's their right to either answer or not, but then they have to accept the consequences that go with that. So I would say the short answer is yes, you can do that, and that there's really nothing wrong with that.
Say you're going out for a service, Wayne, getting a hair appointment, for example. Can you request that the person be fully vaccinated who will give you your haircut? I mean, doesn't that force the employer to ask employees for that personal information so they decide who will be your hairdresser?
Well, that's and again, I think the answer is yes, you can, but you're right. That then gets into a bit more complicated area, because if you're asking, and people are frequently asking, whether or not the person serving you is double vaccinated, then the employer will certainly be pressured to mandate vaccinations for their employees. And if somebody does not want to be vaccinated, then they may be putting their employment, or at least the particular form of their employment, in jeopardy. But again, on a sort of broken record here, those are the consequences that can come as long as it's legitimate. The kind of employment is extremely important. If you're a health worker, hairdresser is a fairly good example. I think of one where there's close personal contact. If you were somebody working in a back room with no public contact, it would be quite unreasonable, I think, for an employer to require vaccination.
Information's floating around everywhere about COVID-19 on the internet. Could there be legal repercussions for people who spread misinformation that actually can be connected to someone getting sick and dying?
Well, I think, again, the answer is yes, that there can be. First of all, on the first point, there is a lot of misinformation out there, and I think part of the really heated debate that's going on right now around vaccines is that many people are operating from different types of information, some more reliable than others. And if you are, first of all, as a website or something, making that information available, there may be some legal consequences, such as negligence. Or if you're spreading that information, that too may produce a claim in negligence, because what you're doing, arguably, is putting your fellow citizens or your neighbors, as they talk about it in law, at risk, and doing it in a way that you should reasonably know is going to happen. Now, that's the next point. It's only really a problem in most cases if you're somewhat aware that the information is false. And that's the real problem. My sense is that most people who are basing their comments and their positions on information are absolutely convinced it's correct.
Right, exactly.
And in fact, going to websites where they get information from sort of like-minded people, so they're convinced their version of reality is correct. And if that's the case, it's hard to have real direct legal consequences.
It'll be interesting to see that land in court, which it may at some point. Wayne, thanks very much for being with us to work through some of these scenarios.
No problem, and it's a hot issue. I believe there's a protest planned outside a hospital on these issues later today, as I understand it. So.
Yeah, we're watching that too. Thanks, Wayne.
Okay, thanks.
Bye-bye. Bye. Wayne McKay, Professor Emeritus of Constitutional Law and our legal columnist on the show.
For more CBC podcasts, go to cbc.ca/podcasts.